So, if we go back in history, we are not in this situation for the first time. If we go back in history, then we have the famous Yamoussoukro Declaration from 1988. And that was now 30 years ago. And then the African countries considered that opening up their aviation markets would be the future. That was followed 11 years later in 1999 by the Yamoussoukro decision. But now, 20 years later, we have made very little progress. Nevertheless, it was great that it was decided also by the African countries in 2017 that it is time to move towards the single African air transport market. And this is now, I would say, kind of a third attempt. Big question, what's different this time?
Thank you, Enrique. First of all, I would like also to congratulate and to thank Qatar Airways for the wonderful dinner and we had yesterday. As you said, the Yamoussoukro Declaration was adopted in 1988. The problem of Yamoussoukro decision was the lack of regulatory framework, a legal framework. 11 years after was adopted the Yamoussoukro decision and approved by the head of states of African Union in 2000 with an interim period of 2 years. The interim period was about the fifth traffic right freedom. And the lack of Yamoussoukro decision, the problem was the lack of an executing agency. In 2009, the African Civil Aviation Commission was appointed as changed its constitution and became the executing agency of Yamoussoukro decision. But the problem is that we realized that many countries were not, in fact, applying the Yamoussoukro decision. I remember when I was CEO of Air Mali, I was opening a route in Central Africa. I met an authority in the country, and we were starting with 3 flights. I told him that we will increase our frequencies to 5 after. He told me that, I said because of Yamoussoukro decision. He replied that Yamoussoukro decision is one thing, but the sovereignty of our countries is a different thing. So you can understand what was really the problem. So in 2015, the head of state decided to go toward a single African air transport market. And immediately, 11 states signed the commitment to SAATM. And the SAATM was officially launched on January 2018. And since an implementation process is going on, in March of 2018, we had a meeting in Abidjan to set up an action plan with 6 pillars. And also in May 2018, we had a ministerial meeting in Lomé and coming up with a memorandum of implementation. Because the thing is that when you are committed to SAATM, you need to review all your bilateral air service agreements so that they comply with the Yamoussoukro decision provision. So, so far, 28 states have signed the commitment to SAATM. Among these states, only 16 states have signed the memorandum of implementation. So we are very far from the full implementation of SAATM.
Thank you very much. Yvonne, you are running an airline, which is also a member of the African Airline Association. Now, among your colleagues, CEOs, is there excitement towards this aviation market now? Do they also feel that this time it's different or not?
Well, I think there's both excitement and some level of skepticism as well. I'm very hopeful that this time is the right time, especially given that SAATM is a flagship project for the African Union Commission, and it's an enabler for a lot of other projects, the free movement, the continental free trade area. So what we're seeing is a change in mindset for a lot of governments, a lot of businesses who see the full potential of the continental free trade area. And this can only succeed if we liberalize the skies as well. Just speaking to other CEOs of African airlines, there is some level of optimism. And at the moment, some CEOs are talking about, let's start with the coalition of the willing. Whoever is ready to start, let's start, and start collaborating amongst ourselves. And once people see that this is the way to go, they'll eventually join in. So there is a level of optimism right now.
And yourself? You're an optimist.
I'm an optimist, absolutely. You have to be in this business.
Well, you know, in Europe also, there are many airlines who actually think that, yes, open skies is a good idea, but not in my backyard necessarily. Yes. And even fair competition, you know, they talk about the fair competition, but once you open up the market for a fair competition, then they really don't like it because they don't like competition by definition. Yeah. Is that also present among the CEOs with your colleagues?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have cases where we request, even with countries who've signed up to SAATM, who we have bilateral agreements with, where you request additional frequencies to the countries and they reject it. You request for a technical stop and they reject it. So there is, as you say, they're not in my backyard sort of mentality, which is unfortunate. But again, I remain optimistic that once people realize the benefits far outweigh the challenges, then we'll get there eventually.
Thank you very much. Vuyani, you are representing the government. You have been as an official also in the transport department. You know a lot of this from the point of view of a government. And what was also said earlier by the fellow panelists, you know, and you have also this present in Europe, which is about the issue of sovereignty, yes, but once it comes to the sovereignty, we think we forget everybody else and everything else, because this kind of overrides it, even though everybody would understand, but by pooling that sovereignty, you actually achieve more. Is South Africa ready for pooling its sovereignty when it comes to the air transport? How do you see that?
Yes, South Africa has already adopted the principle of Yamoussoukro. And since 2006, we had what we call the airlift strategy, which particularly takes into account all the principles. We have adopted a strategy upon which we agree or enter into the framework with the ready and willing partners in the continent. You would also take note that since the inception of the SAATM in 2015, South Africa had led the project up to its launch in January 2018. So it's one of the 2063 agenda, 2063 of the AU pilot project, and which we fully support. And look, I think you would also have appreciated the fact that, yes, the SAATM is now put high on the agenda of the AU. However, for us to realize the single air transport market of the African continent, we need not actually deal with the project in silo. We obviously have to look at a number of other things, like the issue which Yvonne has just raised, the issue of the customs union. We need to also consider issues of establishing an African currency, because it becomes a challenge for airliners as well, or for airline operators, to repatriate some of their earnings in the current framework, because there is uneven environment that actually also exists currently as we are. We also need, obviously, as Africans, to also trade amongst ourselves, to establish the demand for air transport in the continent. And obviously, this project would evolve The SAATM would not have to be imposed, would obviously evolve over time and become a reality, just like how it has happened within your own space in Europe.
Thank you very much. And of course, what you said sounded all very familiar to me. You said customs union, common currency, single aviation market. I can see at least one region which can give you a lot of inspiration concerning that, and we will drill into that also later. Now, when you are talking to your colleagues from other ministries and people dealing with aviation, what do they see as the most difficult issues related to the realization of the single aviation market?
Look, in the main, the biggest challenge is issue of institutionalization of the concept. On paper, yes, we have all the goals, all the ambitious things that we can achieve, but the fact that there's no investment that is actually put, one, in infrastructure, two, in standardization of our safety levels. Yes, there are some initiatives already being actually taken in sub-regions, particularly in the SADC. You would realize that we already have established what we call the SASO, which is the Southern African Safety Organization, obviously aimed at ensuring that we have safety oversight, a regional safety oversight organization that will actually take care of our safety during our operations in a liberalized environment. But some of the issues as well relate to the issues of, there's also some level of political will is also a challenge. Not everybody is actually taken by the stance that we have to liberalize. Some says, look, what is it there for me? If you would realize most of our taxes that goes in aviation in the continent, much of it is never actually directed towards developing the industry itself, but obviously to deal with some of the social ailments that each of us has in the continent. That also becomes a handicap in actually really establishing a proper industry that will function in that space.
I think you are very right. I mean, the big question is also that, you know, what's in it for me? It's a bit of a wrong question, because the right question would be, what is in it for my people? And of course, this is something where people can benefit. You increase the connectivity, you increase the people-to-people contact, and that is what we have experienced by opening up the markets, being in the EU or between the EU and other countries. Now, you also mentioned one thing which I think was important, which is also the possibility of the African carriers to fly to the other African countries. And it seems kind of logical, but I know that it's not always so easy. And there is even a saying, and I believe even that people say that it's even true, that sometimes it's easier to fly from one African country to another via Europe. Now, Yvonne, how about that? And what kind of difficulties are you experiencing when you are establishing new routes to other African countries?
I think I mentioned some of them. The fact that even with the existing bilateral air service agreements with the various countries, we face restrictions on frequencies, on capacity. There's also challenges of one you mentioned, infrastructure, adequate infrastructure in some countries. There's challenges also of visas. It's good to open the skies, but when the borders are closed as well, then that becomes a challenge, hindering free movement of people. So I think some African countries have the most restrictive visa regimes in the world. So that also has to go hand in hand with the liberalization of the skies. We also have challenges of high taxes, high fuel costs. So all these have to be worked on alongside opening up our skies as well. So and in order to facilitate that movement. And as you said, it is true. Getting to some African countries, it's much faster to go via Paris or somewhere else and then go back into the continent. And that needs to change. If we're to have an integrated continent and if we're to trade freely amongst ourselves and move freely amongst the different African countries.
Thank you very much. If I may drill further, more concretely, when Rwanda Air is flying from Kigali to another capital, what difficulty is Rwanda Air having? What you consider the biggest obstacles for you for a good business?
The biggest obstacles, what I mentioned, sometimes we don't get the frequencies that we do need, especially for, even with some of our neighboring countries. We have challenges getting fifth freedom rights in some countries where we'd like to have them. There's also a big challenge of repatriation of funds. Wani mentioned that. We have a few countries in the continent where we're unable to repatriate our funds completely, which then causes a big challenge for us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Abdurrahman. We have now heard what your colleagues in the panel have been also saying about the challenges. What is the African Airline Association doing concretely in order to deal with these challenges and to push it forward?
I think the single African air transport market by itself is not enough, because an airline will operate on a route when there is a market. So that's why the continental free trade area is something very important. As you see, more than 39% of African airlines traffic is toward non-African countries. Only 23% of the traffic is intra-Africa. So for African integration, something has to be done, and to promote cooperation between African countries. As it was said also, you can see that from West Central Africa to Southern Africa, you have 50% of passengers will go via a destination. And from north to south, 80% of passengers. So connectivity is a problem, but we need to have the market so that to improve the connectivity. To answer your question, in AFRAA, we set up some years ago a route network coordination committee. The purpose of the committee is to see airlines, how the airline will cooperate on some routes. Through this committee, airlines have signed a lot of interline agreements and code-share agreement also. Our purpose is to even go further. Why not to create an African alliance? But for me, we are facing some challenges. If you see the SAATM, for example, I have two concerns. The first concern is the lack of leadership to enforce the SAATM, the legal framework. Like in Europe, we doesn't have, for example, a civil aviation court of arbitration today in Africa. How you can bring trust and confidence among African airlines if they feel that the competition is not fair and the legal framework is not there also. Because equal opportunities and fair play ground are very, very important. Because you can have a lot of barriers to competitions. It could be, as we said yesterday, the access to the airport. It could be the slots. It could be the ground handling condition. It could be different non-uniform taxes and charges from one country to another. And also, as Yvonne said, the visa requirement. It's very amazing, for example, in many countries, it's more easy to have an European passport to get your visa on arrival. With an African passport, you cannot get the visa on arrival. So we need really to have an African aviation strategy to accompany the SAATM implementation.
Thank you very much. I think you have actually touched upon some very important and critical points, which sometimes perhaps people also will not actually realize. I mean, while talking about the single African air transport market, this is not a thing in itself. It's actually related to the overall cooperation and consolidation in Africa, and also getting closer with each other and establishing the structures that you were just describing, because it's very clear that when you have the restrictions on visas, when you have all other kinds of difficulties in moving from one country to another within Africa, it is very difficult to make the African market to function. Now, but there are also some very positive stories, and one I want to underline, of course, is safety. And also thanks to the no country left behind policy by the ICAO, Africa has also witnessed over the last years almost none civil aviation casualties. And of course, it's a big change from what it used to be a couple of decades ago. So I really want to congratulate all of you on that. And also I see that the same is happening in the area of security, where you have also stepped up considerably the efforts. And this is all very positive, because it also shows that when there is a will, there is a way. Now that leads me to the question which already you have both mentioned, which is infrastructure. Because let's assume that we would have, the great and the good happens, and there will be a market, and suddenly you will have more flights. What about the infrastructure? What about the airports? What about the air traffic management? How about South Africa? Mubani.
Look, yes, it's true we do not have a good infrastructure to really operationalize the SAATM in some parts of our continent. But however, our view is that as we talk about infrastructure, the biggest question is air transport is demand side kind of services. It is not supply. What we need to stimulate as African governments is to ensure that we trade amongst ourselves first, in order for us to be able then to generate the necessary income, improve the levels of lives of our own people, in order to then have a justifiable investment into the airport or in aviation infrastructure. It makes more logical sense. The fact that we do not have connectivity within the African continent, it is seen to be much better to connect Africa via Europe. It's indicative of the fact that we as Africa, we don't trade amongst ourselves. We don't tour amongst ourselves. And we continuously take away the necessary resources, which could actually be translated into beneficiation of our own communities, in order to really ensure that there is a decent life within the African society. So in that way, I'm trying to indicate that the lack of infrastructure is not necessarily somebody to blame, but obviously ourselves, our own resources are not used for the African community. We are actually obviously aligned along the lines of our political loyalty, and that on its own has got its own history, which I don't want to dwell on it, but I think it's time that as Africa we need to realize the need for us to work together and ensure that we actually consolidate our resources to ensure that they actually benefit our own communities, and actually therefore would have the justification to establish that very demand that we need, which is air transport, to enhance our competitiveness globally as well, and even intercontinentally.
Thank you very much, and I think that again you are putting the finger in the right place. Also, it's also about the scarce resources. It's also about the prioritization, and you know, we talk about the airport infrastructure, for example, because we are very keen to see the air traffic increasing and new opportunities. At the same time, of course, we know how difficult it is in the connectivity within the country, with rail, with roads, which also demand the investment. So it's not that easy to make those choices, and in a way, the air transport technically should be the only one of those different transport modes which can also self-sustain in a way. And also, I mean, what I have understood is that in Africa, about almost one-fifth or one-fourth of the tourism jobs are actually related also to the air transport market. So it is a very, very important source of revenue, and that is hopefully something that helps the governments to make the decisions. Now, Yvonne, you probably will see the infrastructure challenge on a daily basis also by landing in different airports. How do you assess the situation, and what would you like the African governments to do in relation to infrastructure? I mean also the infrastructure both on the ground and in the air.
Well, there are challenges in some countries, but we're also seeing some positive trends in other countries where a lot of investment is going towards aviation infrastructure. We've seen Ethiopia, which has just expanded its airport. In my own country, Rwanda, we're building a new airport because we've reached capacity at the current airport. So there are some positive stories behind that. And if more governments invested the money that's collected in aviation towards aviation infrastructure as opposed to diverting it to other projects. But as you say, there are priorities. Maybe hospitals are needed, schools are needed, but more African countries need to realize the importance of the aviation industry in terms of supporting the full economy of the country. I'll give an example of Rwanda, which has signed up to SAATM and has the open skies policy. We've seen tourism become the #1 foreign exchange earner. We've seen Rwanda becoming the number 3 in terms of conference tourism in the continent in a very short period of time. And that's not only because of opening the skies, but having the right government policies in place to support the industry. Rwanda lifted the visa requirements. You receive visas on arrivals for all citizens of all countries in the world. Not only, it started with the African citizens, and now it's to all citizens of the world. So it's that realization that aviation really is a pillar of the economy. So investment has to be made in order to develop the industry, in order to support the rest of the economy. So I would like to see more of that happening in more African countries.
Thank you very much. You want to say aviation being one of the pillars of the economy of the Ramana. So, as the African Airline Association, how are you pushing forward the pillar when it comes to the infrastructure? What are your members mostly complaining about? I can tell you, in Europe, when I see the colleagues from the association, they complain about the capacity, not enough capacity in the air, too high airport charges. In a way, compared to you, these are a bit of a luxury problems. Sorry to say. But what about your members?
Infrastructure is the pillar #4 of the action plan of SAATM.
That is the flagship projects and all this, yeah.
Yes.
2063.
And when you talk about infrastructure, you have obviously ground and air. On the ground, we are seeing in many states new airports being built by authorities. And I can see that sometimes there is no consultation with the users of these airports, and sometimes it ends up with increasing of charges before consultation of airlines. 2 weeks ago, I was traveling to one country, I don't want to give the name, to meet the Minister of Transport, because they built a very new airport, but they are increasing the user charges on this airport. So this is a problem for our airlines. When you talk about the ground also, we need to talk about the handling, the aircraft's handling. Sometimes you can see that you have monopolistic pricing on many stations in Africa. This is also a very big problem we need to address. When you come to the air infrastructure, you have 36 air navigation providers in Africa.
Well, in Europe, we have almost the same, and we have less countries.
Okay, so one project of AU, African Union, is also to come to go toward a single African sky. This is very important. I can tell you some stories. When you are flying from Ouagadougou to Abidjan, it's only 1 hour and 30 minutes. They are border countries. Sometimes the arrival procedure, you have to go to above Ghana air navigation. So you will pay for that. You will pay also for ASECNA. When you are going from West Africa to Central Africa, you can go through 4 or 5 providers, and you have to pay for that also. And even, I don't know if now it's settled, I remember that when you are flying sometime in Africa, you even don't have the communication with any air navigation or with any air navigation system or on the ground. There are some, as we say, blind areas. So these are really some problems we need to address. And also, the traffic will grow in Africa. Every 15 years, the traffic will double. That means that we need to prepare for capacity of airports. Exactly. Yesterday, we were talking about slot allocation in Europe. It will come also in Africa. So we need to anticipate and to be prepared to face all these issues.
Thank you very much. I think you also reminded us about many things, some of them similar, but some show the real depth of the challenge that you have. But one important thing which I should have maybe said in the beginning is also that the potential for the African market is very big. And even the forecasts, which are based on, I would say, the evolutionary scenario, not revolutionary, that you might make some leaps in terms of the opening up the skies. 2014, 127 million, 235, 350 million passengers. So about almost 6% every year growth. But I'm sure that Africa has the potential even to do a double-digit growth in certain years when you are opening up more. I think you also pointed out the issue of competition. Like if you don't have competition when it comes to ground handling, for example, then the airlines are subject to monopolistic pricing. Now, Yvonne, I'm going to rephrase a question that I originally wanted to ask. I wanted to ask you whether you think that the charges for airports and for air navigation are too high, but the airlines always say they are too high. So I'll ask you, are they unjustifiably high?
I believe they're, coming from the airline, I believe they're unjustifiably high. And this then translates to higher ticket prices. So within the African continent, air tickets are, I think, 45% higher than in other parts of the world, which really does not make sense. So on top of the airport charges, plus navigation charges, plus landing fees, plus parking fees, everything is much higher, plus higher fuel costs. All this translates to really, really high ticket prices. And then that restricts the number of people who can travel within the continent. Africa accounts for 16% of the world's population, but in terms of aviation, it's less than 4%. So it's a fraction of that. So we do need to open the skies, have more competition, reduce the airfare. With more competition comes reduction in airfares, and then also realize that the government policies have to support that growth. So reduction in all those taxes and charges as well.
You mentioned earlier also the positive developments in Rwanda in terms of the prioritization of air transport and understanding. Would you say that also in terms of the charges, Rwanda is a good example or a positive example?
I think the charges could go lower. I know my counterparts at the airport will not agree. But they're not the highest in the continent. At least that's a positive. That's a positive part. But there is room for improvement there. And the positive thing for Rwanda as well is that the money goes to support the aviation industry as well. So I can't complain too much because it also helps us at the airport as well. But there is room for improvement. We need to get the number of people traveling to grow. We have way too many of our citizens preferring to travel 16 hours by bus as opposed to taking a 1-hour flight. So this really needs to change if we are to have a free movement of goods and services.
And Africa, of course, is a fantastic continent with great nature, wonderful people, and we just very often don't know enough about it because of the limitations to access, to be honest.
Yeah.
And that can change, and tourism has a huge potential in that sense. South Africa, Vuvani, are you keeping the tariffs decent?
Look, I would say for now it's still tough a bit. I think we are comparing with our colleagues in the region. Obviously, we cannot really deviate from such, but we do have, obviously, depending obviously on your operations, the necessary tariff relief, sort of scheme even for those who are establishing new routes into South Africa. But obviously that is normally dependent on the city concerned with that particular airport. Because you would see like the Dube Trade Port, which is the King Shaka International Airport. It's a fairly new airport. Obviously the city of Durban has got its own incentive schemes that are provided for either foreign or even national carriers that actually fly out of that point. Similarly, with Cape Town, you would see that we have also the concept of the aerotropolis cities that we are actually developing in the country, which obviously is meant mainly to get the municipal authorities that are responsible for the operation of that airport to incentivize its own operations into that particular airport. But we are not far-fetched. I think we are closer today.
Yvonne, do you fly to South Africa?
Yes, we fly to both Joburg and Cape Town. Yeah.
So tell me, what's your experience?
Actually, South Africa is one of the better countries to fly. And I'm not saying that because one is sitting next to me. He mentioned Cape Town. We just started our route to Cape Town last year. And they were very supportive in terms of helping us set up, in terms of incentives that they were giving. And the route is doing extremely well. Same thing with Johannesburg. So he is right. South Africa is one of the better success stories.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. So we have some good examples to build on. And of course, I mean, historically also South Africa has been one of the more visited African countries by non-African visitors. But of course, I very much hope that the others are catching up fast. Now, let's move a bit from infrastructure to competition. And we have spoken in the beginning also about the African market, which would increase the competition internally. What about the non-African carriers? Because what we have today is that I think there are now more non-African carriers serving the continent than African carriers from other parts of the world. And one of those very successful carriers is also our host here, Qatar. So how do you see and how do your members see the competition for routes outside Africa with non-African carriers?
Very hard. Today, more than 80% of intercontinental traffic is carried by non-African airlines.
And that needs to change, right?
Yes, it needs obviously to change. There are many reasons about that. You know, in Africa, there are many small operators, And because our business is a high capitalistic one, for many years, states had been the owners of some African carriers. And many African states cannot fund the airline to sustain their growth. Because if you want to go to intercontinental flights, you need a lot of money. And sometimes they don't have this money. Sometimes these airlines are not are mismanaged because the government management is not the best one. We have some few exceptions in Africa, of course. But my feeling is that you need to have an intra-Africa business very strong so that it can support also the intercontinental flights. Because if you see the big carriers, non-African carriers coming in Africa, they operate through their hub. In Europe, for example, from West Africa to Paris, you have more than 40% of traffic not going to Paris. They are not stopping to Paris, they are continuing. So if an African airline has to go to Paris on point to point, first it will not have the business travelers, because business travelers are going through over the world. So this is also an issue. So the single African air transport market should be considered also as a means to strengthen our African airline so that they can compete with non-African carriers for intercontinental routes.
I can't agree more with you, and really, I think it's very much in the African interest, but also in the interest of the overall connectivity that the African carriers will also take a much bigger slice in this traffic. I mean, you have some very good examples of African carriers who have been able to penetrate that market. Ethiopian Airlines is, for example, one of them. What do you think is their success?
I was talking about the hub. One of the success of Ethiopian is the hub of Addis Ababa. If you go to Addis at 8 in the morning, you can see in the airport the number of aircraft, the passengers connecting, and this is key for the development of African airlines. I can talk also about Royal Air Maroc in Casablanca. You have a lot of connections also through Casablanca. So we have some successes in Africa, but you need, as I said, to have a very strong African network and to have a hub if you want to succeed. But unfortunately, you have only 4 or 5 hubs in Africa today. True. You have Addis, you have Casablanca, you have Nairobi. Johannesburg, you have Nairobi, maybe soon Kigali, I hope. So it's very important to develop hubs in Africa.
Very true. So Kigali to be a hub, and you're competing with the non-African carriers. How is it going?
Well, our strategy is definitely to build Kigali as a hub and have it as an alternative to the other hubs as well. We have no problems competing with non-African carriers. The challenge for us is when we're not given the same opportunities as the non-African carriers, especially when we want to operate in other African countries. So it's much easier for non-African carriers to get all the slots, the permissions, the rights, full rights, than African carriers. So as long as we have the same playing field, then we can compete. And I think it's also important, a lot of the smaller African airlines are realizing that really we need to collaborate amongst ourselves and leverage economies of scale in order to compete effectively with the larger carriers and non-African carriers as well. So we're seeing a positive trend towards that, realizing that we have to work together amongst ourselves. But the different countries also have to level the playing field.
Thank you very much. And well, good luck in developing Kigali as a hub and Rwanda Air as the strongest member of that hub. We haven't yet spoken about the low-cost carriers in Africa. Now, South African air market was one of the perhaps most developed, maybe even still is, also historically. What about the potential of low-cost in South Africa?
Yes, in South Africa, you would understand that we have got numerous airlines that are established there. We have had quite a number of low-cost airlines. Currently, Kulula, operated by Come. We also have Mango, which is actually the subsidiary of SAA. And we have, obviously, FlySafe Air, which are also newly established, but they have been in the market, but doing something else. Yes, low cost is actually happening, but it has not really spread on into the continent, deep into the continent. It's limited mostly to the region. And we see that as another opportunity that obviously brings more positive benefits to the consumers, particularly the public. They do actually receive better services on that, other than actually going through the traditional or the service airlines. There is that potential that is there in South Africa, and I think even the region as well, and particularly in the current circumstances that we envisage to see the singular transport market actually happening. Obviously, the key to that would be the need to see the development of the low-cost carriers in the continent.
Thank you very much. I very much agree with you. I mean, again, if we build on the European experience of opening up the markets and creating the single European aviation market, then I think, well, the decision which everybody understands is that we opened up the market full liberalization of all the freedoms. But what we tend sometimes to forget was the second, even maybe more important step, was the full liberalization of ownership and control within the EU. And that then created the pan-European carriers, which are called also the low-cost carriers, and which are driving the growth in Europe. Almost exclusively all the real growth, even today, is driven by the low-cost carriers like Ryanair, Wizz Air, EasyJet, and so on. Abdurrahman, what about the low-cost in Africa? What about the potential of creating real pan-African carriers in the future?
First, I will put this statement. You cannot have a low-fare airlines in a high-cost environment. In Africa, we are in a high-cost environment. It's not easy to access market. If you want to have a low cost, you need to have high density routes and high utilization of your aircraft. What will happen if you don't have the market? This is an issue. And low cost is limited, as you said, to some part of Africa today. South, east, north, because of the density on some routes there. It's not the case throughout Africa. Today, the low-cost carriers represent in Africa 8.7 in terms of market share. The average, world average, is more than 20%. So there are lot of things to do. But in Europe, as you said, low-cost carrier came after the liberalization, as was instrumental to the growth of traffic. And also today in Europe, you have cabotage also, which is benefiting to low-cost areas. So in Africa, we have a long way to go if you want really to develop low-cost carriers.
Thank you very much. Now we have had very inspiring discussion here. We have a couple of minutes left. Any questions from the audience? Do I see anybody? No, I see something there, yes. It's a bit sort of, I get the light in my face, but I think there's a lady there, yes. I don't see who, but I see somebody.
Anita Mosner.
Anita, okay, yeah, I thought it might be you. Please.
Oh, good morning. You, this is for the panel generally. You chatted a bit about the obstacles to these, the establishment of low-fare airlines. What we have found in certain places is that communities that want air service have actually pressed for development of better infrastructure. Do you see this in any of your major cities in terms of trying to make themselves perhaps more competitive or more hospitable for enhanced air service?
Thank you very much. Very good question. Yvonne, perhaps you could take it?
Oh, I'm not sure I understood the question very well, but...
Is there a pressure coming also from the communities themselves to have more air service and by that also incentivizing the low cost?
We do get a lot of requests to start operating in different cities. But there still remains the challenge of whether there's enough sufficient market to operate those routes. And again, it goes down to whatever government policies are in place in terms of taxes, the fuel costs, the airport charges, etc. So that still remains a limitation. But there is willingness to allow airlines to come in, especially from different communities. But the right policies have to be in place. The right measures have to be in place to make it commercially viable for airlines to go into those communities.
Bhuvani, is there a pressure in South Africa? It's a large country and also with a good history in aviation from the communities?
I would say there are some areas where there is really the need for that, for the services. But however, like my colleagues have said, currently aviation, because of the current challenges of investment required in the industry and the high cost of actual operation of that, it's actually currently perceived to be services for the elite, not necessarily for every Tom, Dick, and Harry. I think some of us would be more on the taxis or be on the buses or trains to our destinations than using air transport as a means to contribute to the economic development of a country. So those are some of the challenges that we still have. High cost of actually providing that service is still a challenge for most of us.
Thank you very much. 30 years ago in Europe, aviation was also something for the wealthier, well-off, and it was a luxury business. Things have changed. Now it's cheaper in Brussels to take a flight to, I don't know, Dublin than to take a taxi to the airport. Life changes. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, there is one gentleman there, please.
The gentleman is Pablo Manuselion.
Now, again, I couldn't just, it's a light.
No, I'm your shadow, Henrik. I'm always in your shadow, and that's how it ought to be. I have a question on all those rules. I understand that the treaties, Yamoussoukro and so on, have been made 20, 30 years ago. Now, new arrangements are being in place. The question which came to my mind is how to enforce all of those rules. I mean, we have supranational bodies, as Henrik knows better than anyone else, perhaps, to tell airline states, listen, you should do this, you should open up frequencies, and capacity should be lifted, competition should be enforced. In other words, the way I understand you, but this may be a misconception from my side, is that it's still based on it has still to be executed, all those measures which you were referring to on frequencies, capacity, pricing maybe, although you didn't refer to that, on a voluntary basis. There is no, let's say, supranational body which tells Rwanda or South Africa, Nigeria, listen, you shouldn't refuse those traffic rights, or you shouldn't do this or that to Rwanda Air, for instance. Is that a right conclusion, or is there something which dictates airlines and countries, you ought to do this in order to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. You already have touched upon it briefly, Abderrahmane, but nevertheless, I would ask you to reply if you could be concise, because our time is up, but I would still like to have all of you to answer to one question. So, please.
You got exactly the right view on the situation. We need an empowered executing agency to enforce the SAATM. This is lacking today, and for me it's a big problem. As Yvonne said, some countries have signed the SAATM, but today, when you ask for a fifth freedom right, they will refuse it. There is no power to force them to give you the rights.
Thank you very much, and I think that this is something also where perhaps the European experience can give you inspiration, and we will be talking about that with you in 10 minutes when we have our bilateral meeting. But now, before that, 30 seconds to everyone. 6th of February, 2025, single African air transport market. Where are we, Yvonne?
Hopefully, as I remain optimistic, it's fully enforced, and whenever Rwandair wants to fly into a country, we just need to notify them and send our schedule, and then we start. That's my hope, and not negotiate lengthy bilateral negotiations.
Thank you. Vubani.
I'm hopefully thinking then it will be, we would have institutionalized the concept, and there would be more collaboration among the African airlines to also be able to cushion the competition, obviously, that comes from other non-African airlines, and they will remain competitive within the continent.
Thank you very much, Abderrahmane. 6th of February 2025, you would still be the proud Secretary General. What would you tell us about the success of the single African air transport market?
I am optimistic. We need to advocate and to communicate. We need to have a sort of forum to listen to those operators and states who still have some concerns, and to see how we can address these concerns.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say to all the panelists on behalf of me, and I'm sure on behalf of the audience, first of all, a big thank you. And secondly, I think we all have faith in the single African air transport market if it's driven by people like you. So, good luck.
Thank you.